Hello and good evening. The South Caribbean Conference of Seventh-day Adventists is pleased to present our ninth installment of the Surviving a Family Crisis series. This evening, we are learning about the 10 secrets of bouncing back well in a crisis. We're very thankful to have with us this evening none other than the South Caribbean Conference President, Pastor Leslie Moses. As we know, Pastor Moses is an adjunct lecturer at the University of the Southern Caribbean. He is a family life leader. He is someone who has spent a lot of time educating on family life, counseling, and we're very happy to have him deal with a topic that is intended to give us hope and direction in a time of COVID-19. Pastor Moses, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me, Randall Hector.
So before we begin, Pastor Moses, we'd like you to offer a word of prayer for those who are watching now around here and around the world.
Great God in heaven, we thank you for being with us thus far in our journey through COVID-19. I pray you would bless us and keep us as we talk to resilience today. Please teach us how to be stronger as we go forward, dealing with the issues of life. Be with the technology and help that as we work with the technology, it would help us to work for you and to speak on your behalf. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen, amen. Thank you very much, Pastor Moses. The technology is now an essential tool in us spreading the gospel message at a time like this. So we're dealing now with bouncing back in a crisis. How important is it for us to know about a crisis? Isn't this a once in a lifetime thing, Pastor Moses?
Actually not. For some people, they will have multiple crises throughout their lifetime.
Right.
Of course, many people before COVID didn't know what a crisis was. On the other hand, there were many people who had many and varied crises during their lifetime. On the first program we had when we talked about a crisis, we defined a crisis as an event that would essentially disable us from our normal functioning in our families and in our home. It is a major stressful event. And it is of such that it can either make us or break us. But the reality is crises will be with us for the rest of our lives, actually. And as has been seen during this pandemic, during this crisis, some people are experiencing a crisis within a crisis.
Yes.
So an event like the death of a loved one, the death of a spouse, the death of a child, the loss of your home because of fire, the loss of a job, an extramarital affair. These are all considered to be crises that we experience. And some people are living with a crisis because of a health challenge. Others are experiencing that crisis and then this crisis. And on top of these two crises, a family member passes away because of COVID-19. So you have complexities of crises in one's life. And, dealing with one is hard enough. Dealing with multiple crises is quite another story. And so today we're talking about resilience, how to be able to handle a crisis, how to live through a crisis and come out well. And that has been the objective of the programs that we've been doing for the last, is it 9 Sunday evenings?
This is the night Sunday evening, yes.
So this is one of the objectives, to help people, come out of this thing called this pandemic and come out well. I have some points. Yes, go ahead, Randall.
No, Pastor, I heard you say that basically you seem to be making the point that crises crises are events that we should expect in life.
Oh, yes.
And it seems, regardless of who you are, there must be some crisis in your life. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. Correct.
And so you mentioned the word resilience a number of times this evening in your prayer. You also said it while you were speaking. What is this? Why do you keep telling us about resilience?
Because resilience is that thing that helps us to, to weather the storm of a crisis. Resilience is that thing that helps us to, in spite of the crisis, to make it and to thrive, to be able to get out of it in one piece, if you will. And so this matter of resilience is critical in a crisis and in managing a crisis. And so today we want to talk about resilience, what it is, and possibly who has it, who doesn't have it, how to get it, how to build it, maybe, if you will. That is where we're going this evening. And we have some PowerPoints to help us with that. And so I'm going to ask our guys who are working with us to put up the PowerPoints if you can. And I'll go through, Randall, the various slides. I'm going to do it really quickly because we lost a little bit of time this afternoon.
Sure.
Feel free, Randall, to stop me at any time and ask a question for the sake of our listeners.
Of course.
Because our listeners are all over the world and we are happy to have them. So stop me at any time. And of course, we would like to have our listeners send questions, and hopefully I can finish this quick enough so we can take a number of questions. So let's go to our first slide, or second slide actually, as we begin the presentation. Of course, the second slide shows us indeed that crisis or a crisis is inevitable. Next slide. Of course, as you listen to the news and to the media, you realize that some people do not do well in a crisis. And it's sad, but it is true, not just in Trinidad, but in other parts of the world, physicians cannot cope with the burden of dealing with this pandemic. So a number of physicians have committed suicide, including one physician in Trinidad. Children are reported to have committed suicide. Of course, you don't always know why people commit suicide unless they leave a note or some indicator or they tell somebody, this thing is too much for me. But it is assumed that several children who committed suicide during this pandemic did it because they couldn't go to school. Maybe they're missing their friends, they're missing their regular activities. They just couldn't cope, and so they ended it. Next slide. The Bible is a book of life, Randall Hector. It's a book to life. It's a book about life. And it is interesting to note that we have many crises in the Bible. Of course, God is able to deal with every crisis. He's able to help us with every crisis. And in 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 6, we have a good example of resilience, how to deal with a crisis. The Bible tells us in verses 1 to 5 that David was in real trouble. He lost his home by fire. He lost his wives and his children because they were kidnapped by an opposing community or opposing tribe, opposing people. And then when his men realized that this was too much for them to bear, they themselves couldn't deal with their own crisis, they decided that they would kill David. And they said they will stone him to death. Of course, the Bible says that David, who was a man after God's own heart, the Bible says in 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 6, I'm reading from the Message first, it says, David strengthened himself with trust in his God. The King James Version says, he encouraged himself in the Lord. That is resilience. Next slide. All right. Of course, Randall, you there? You hearing me?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here, Pastor. So I'm still
Good.
going to the definition now.
Right, yes, because the internet was kind of behaving badly a few seconds ago. So definition, we have several definitions of resilience. I will not take the time. Of course, I would encourage our online listeners to go back to this YouTube channel and to, if you need to go through the slides again as with the others that happened before, I would want to encourage you to go back and look again so you can get the information. So in the interest of time, I will not go through all the definitions except to say the first one says resilience is the successful coping of family members under adversity that enables them to flourish with warmth, support, and cohesion. Let's go to the next slide, and we will get some, more common people definitions. Those definitions were definitions by scholars who study resilience and how it works in various settings. So, a definition I like it very much is that resilience is the ability to bounce back in the face of a crisis. And this one is the one I like very much, Randall. And I've shared this with my students for many years. And the illustration I use for this example of resilience is taking a wind ball we would call in Trinidad a tennis ball, a lawn tennis ball, throwing it against a wall and seeing that ball come back. Resilience is the ability to come back. It is the ability to bounce back. It is the ability to bend back and not break during a crisis. If you take a tree and you bend it, depending on how much you bend it, the branch will break. Resilience is the ability to bend back and not break. Dr. Yehuda shared this definition. I like this one very much. It's like the Timex watch. She says, it takes a licking, but it keeps on ticking. So even though it's getting blows, it is still going on. That is resilience. One big question then is, in the study of resilient people, what it is that makes one resilient. And I hope that if that question is not answered during the press, I'm not going to answer it directly. If you still don't get the answer, Randall, that will be the first question to ask when I'm done. But I hope that as we go through the presentation, you will be able to answer that question for yourself. Next slide. Right, so is it because of trait? Is it because you're made up that way? DNA and genes. Is it because your father is resilient, your mother was resilient, so you have it too? Is it environmental, learning to cope based on what's going on around you? Or is it a process? You learn from one step to the other, and you learn how to become resilient. Is it that? And we will answer that this afternoon. Next slide. Of course, we need to note that some of our capacity for resilience comes from our inherent potential, and some come from what we learn over time. The good news is, Randall, that the great God that made us, the great God that made the human brain, made it in a way so that the human brain, in good working order, has tremendous capacity to learn and to pick up information about how to cope. God made our brains like that. Of course, many of the scholars that I've studied and used over the years, they don't believe in God. So as far as they're concerned, This is Mother Nature. This is evolution, evolutionary theory that caused our brains to work like this. I'm here to declare that this is not because of evolution. This is because of how God made us. All right? Our self-regulation skills are vitally important for adapting to many kinds of threats to human experience. And all of this came from Dr. Anne Masten, a scholar in resilience, a scholar that has studied resilience. So we can therefore say that while we cannot say why some people are resilient, because the fact is, from a psychological perspective, from an anthropological perspective, people who study from a sociological perspective, people who study resilience cannot say for sure it is this or that or the other. But the fact is, regardless of what it is, there are things that are happening to cause people to become resilient. And if individuals in crisis choose to fight back, and that's a critical factor, one's choice to fight back, then there is a God who has given us the capacity. He has given us what we need to help us, to give us a fighting chance. Next slide. So there is overwhelming research that evidenced the efficacy of spirituality regarding positive outcomes. So we're looking now at some of the things that resilient people have in common. So there are 10 things. And the first one I chose to talk to is spirituality. And we are saying that spirituality is a significant factor to help in terms of resilience. Resilient people are also spiritual people. That's the point I'm making. Spiritual disciplines, like prayer, Bible study, prayer and fasting. All right, I just lost my screen there. Going to church. Yes. Fighting up with my own technology. Going to church, reading your Bible, participating in worship, in fellowship with the members. Those are very helpful to help us thrive. Of course, people who study resilience and who study the psychology of religion also tell us that there is positive religious coping and there is negative religious coping. And while both of them will help, one would help more than the other. Positive religious coping is seeing God as a friend. Negative religious coping is seeing God as an enemy or seeing ourselves as an enemy to God. The research says that the people who have positive religious coping, the people who pray and know that they can tap in to a greater source, a source beyond themselves, outside of themselves, the people who know that God is their friend and that when they pray, they're not praying to an enemy, the people who know that, God will see them through whatever they're going through, and that God will forgive them of their sins, they will thrive better. The whole matter of justification by faith, the whole matter of sanctification by faith, you understanding for yourself that you're a child of God, you are precious to God, and that God is on your side will help you cope with stress. If you feel like Job felt sometimes that what's going on with him is because he sinned and because God did not forgive his sins and because, God isn't hearing his prayer and he's too worthless and too no good for God to help. That is negative religious coping, and of course that doesn't help very much. It doesn't help as well as positive religious coping. Next slide. Another very important factor to help us become resilient is communication. I like how the message rendering of the Bible portrays James chapter 1 verse 19. Eugene Patterson renders this text this way. He says, lead with your ears in relation to communication. Lead with your ears, follow with your mouth, and let anger struggle along in the rear. The King James Version says, listen twice as much as you speak, and anger will not be a part of that experience. And I paraphrase the King James Version there. So communication first, basic. Listen more, talk less. Some people talk too much, and that creates a lot of problems, a lot of other kinds of problems. And so while life is normal and everything is good, one of the keys to good communication is make family communication a priority. When you're in a crisis, make it a bigger priority. In other words, make time and give yourself fully to communication. And as you communicate, focus when communicating. Don't be cooking dal and rice and curry mango and curry gluten and curry, what's that other thing that you get in health foods? Curry chunks while you're talking with your children and your spouse in a crisis. Take off the stove, cover the pot, and sit down eye to eye, face to face, and talk with the person and listen to the person. So focus. Additionally, I like to share in seminars and marriage seminars, and when I speak to my students at the USC, that usually when we upset with somebody, we don't touch them, we don't embrace them, we don't kiss them. We try to push them as far back as possible, and so touching is something we do not do when we are upset. I like to suggest that even when in a crisis and when you're upset, fight and go against the grain to touch. Not touch in a big way, but touch in small ways. Teach your children to embrace touch, and teach your spouse to embrace touch even when there is disagreement in a relationship. And I'm saying in a crisis, learn to touch. Of course, this is not always brother-husband erogenous touch or sexual touch. Just touching somebody on their hand while you're talking, on their shoulder, is very helpful. Remember that touch is a very big thing in terms of stimulation, and it helps tremendously to get the message across. Of course, in communication, and we could spend the entire evening talking about communication. In communication, it is very important also, especially for children, to explain to them what's going on, to explain to them why daddy is no longer coming home, or why daddy is coming home less frequently, or why he's sleeping out. Explain, that he's in the hospital, or that he has died, or that maybe, he is focusing on somebody else or some other family. And depending on the age of the child, you have to be very careful about how you share that information. But it is important to break it down for the child, break down the cause of the crisis for the child at the child's level so that the child would understand. The point here is communication is vital to survival in a crisis. Next slide. The next slide is having a positive outlook. That simply is being optimistic. Optimism helps tremendously in terms of dealing with crisis. It was Viktor Frankl, noted a psychologist, who believed that it was best to focus on what is left rather than what is lost whenever possible. Some people look too much back. They focus too much on what has happened and what is past. They live in the past and they die in the past instead of looking forward to what is possible in the future. It's very important also, Randall, to to audit, I should say, what you're thinking about during a crisis or when you have a problem. Too many of us share with ourselves and we churn those thoughts. It is called ruminating in psychology and in counseling. We churn in our heads too much and too often negative thoughts. Negative thoughts will give you negative outcomes. So some people in a crisis will say to themselves, and they say it over and over, over and over. In the morning when they get up, that's what they're thinking and saying, I will not make it, or this is too difficult, or I have had enough, or this doesn't make sense anymore. Those negative thoughts, will not help you. Some people who eventually commit suicide say to themselves, it is hopeless, there is no way out except through the route of killing myself. So what you tell yourself in a crisis, my friend, looking on at this program is going to be very important for you to navigate that crisis. Say instead, maybe it is hard, but I will make it. With God's help, I will handle this one. Me and God working on this, we will get through this. Me and my family, in spite of the fact that we have lost everything, we will get some things back. Maybe you can say, I have messed up, but God is a God of second chances. He will help me through this one. I like what 2 Corinthians 4 verses 8 and 9, Paul says, again, I love how Eugene Patterson puts it. He says, we have been surrounded and battered by trouble, but we are not demoralized. We're talking about a positive outlook. We are not sure what to do, but we know that God knows what to do. We have been spiritually terrorized, but God hasn't left our side. We have been thrown back, but we have not been broken. That's good news, my friends. That is having a positive outlook. That is being resilient. Next slide. Then, of course, flexibility is critical. The ability to be able to, in spite of your losses, to fit into a space that is not your space. Some children will not thrive because in their minds, daddy took me to school every day, or mommy read Bible stories for me every night. Mommy is no longer here, and so I am going to just cry all night because I don't want anybody to tell me Bible stories. There has to be some flexibility. There has to be that freedom that you give yourself to say to yourself, this is not what I'm accustomed to. This is not what I normally eat. This is not what I normally do. This is not how I normally live. But because of this situation, I just have to do with what I have. I don't have the whole loaf to eat, but thank God at least I have half a loaf. I will eat that half and be satisfied. Flexibility is very important. Next slide. Of course, financial management is a critical variable as well, a critical factor in developing resilience and in maintaining resilience. I need to say that one of the biggest stressors for a husband and a father is to be out of work, to be laid off, or to have less financial resources, and his family is there, and the babies are crying for milk, and there is nothing to cook, and the landlord is asking, when will the rent be paid? And it's 3 months now, rent hasn't been paid. And the father is there having to deal with a family and not being able to take care of the family economically. That is a man's, well, most men, because you have some lazy fellas, right? They may care. sorry for the bad language, they don't care. Let's talk proper English now. They don't care whether the rent is paid or whether the wife has to go out and work and he sleeps whole day. You do have some men like that. Sorry, guys, but that's the reality. Not all of you, though. Thank God we have some very good husbands, some men who do their work and who stand up as men and who, go out there and fight with the lions and fight with the tigers to ensure that food comes home. And we thank God for those men. So when he cannot bring food home, that for him is a major stressor. So when a crisis comes and money is depleted or reduced or non-existent, knowing how to get money, honestly, of course, and spending or managing that money well in a crisis helps you to bounce back better. So financial management, managing the little you have, hopefully you get some if you have none, that helps. Next slide. Family recreation. Family recreation. And I like this one very much. There's an old adage that says the family that prays together stays together. Sorry to be the one to tell you, even though it's an adage, it isn't always true. Because a lot of families who pray together, not together right now. I would say, as a family life educator and as a family life counselor, the family that prays together has a better chance of staying together. Because as we said earlier, prayer is one of those things that help you to bounce back. So you have a greater chance, right? I also like to say, the family that plays together and has fun together, they also stay together. In other words, they have a greater chance of staying together. That ability to play, especially when you have children. And by the way, wives, husbands love to play too. Of course, we can't get into that when Pastor Sampson and the others talk about the marital, surviving marital or gaining marital intimacy in a crisis, and we are closed and we only have husbands and wives. Pastor Sampson and others will tell you what kind of play we're talking about. And by the way, if you have not yet registered for that online Zoom marriage seminar that is free of charge, I want to encourage you to do so quickly because we have limited space. I plan to be there as a participant. My wife and I, we will be there, and we encourage you to be there too. And they will tell you, I hope, some of the things, wives, that husbands like to do in terms of recreational and play activity that they like to do with their wives, all right? So this is not the time for that. But the point I'm making is there has to be that sense that as a family, we could still have some fun together in spite of the fact that the house burned down. In spite of the fact that somebody died, we can still, it may not be immediate, we can still have some laughter. We can still have some fun. And I just want to say to you at this point, do not underestimate the power of laughter. Some people look at me sometimes and think that I am going mad because I'm driving and I'm laughing. I'm working and I'm laughing. That is how I operate, because laughter is such a good thing, it helps. The Bible actually says in Proverbs, the wise man Solomon says in Proverbs 17:22, New Living Translation, a cheerful heart is good medicine, but a broken spirit, a depressed spirit, saps up a person's strength. I like to say, and I've said it to my students, at USC, when you're laughing, don't stifle it. Some people, they have an opportunity to laugh and they're stifling the laugh. They're trying to fight the laugh because they want to see people in that vulnerable state. I like to say, my friends, when you're laughing, laugh so much that if you want to go in the toilet, after the laugh, you have to run to the toilet. Laugh it out and blow it out. Bust it out. And that helps you. It helps your brain functioning. It helps your emotional stability. And it helps you to remember that you are human too. And by the way, husbands and wives, it's good to laugh with each other and laugh at each other. That's one of the parameters that we know that will tell us that husbands and wives are in trouble when they have stopped laughing with each other. Next slide. This one for me is a big one. Rituals and routines. What we understand from a psychological perspective, especially for children, and I'm not going to read the slide because time is running out and I want to give some time to questions. What we understand from a psychological perspective, that especially children, especially in the minds of children, you see those things called rituals and routines, and even from an adult perspective, those help us to understand that while life is unpredictable and has been unpredictable, for the last few weeks and for the last few months because of this thing called COVID-19, because we are doing these routines and these rituals, it helps us to get a sense that we are getting back to a normal functioning level. An additional value of rituals and routines is when people experience crises in the future, some of those rituals help them to go back in their memory and remember the experiences of childhood. Remember the experiences of family worship and church worship. Those shared experiences help people to remember that things were good at one time, and just remembering the past, the positive past, if you will, those good past things that happened through those rituals, those Boxing Day activities, those Christmas Day activities, for us, the Adventists, morning worship and evening worship, Friday night worship for my family. That's a big ritual. We make a big thing out of Friday evening worship. And one of my responsibilities in my home, as the head of my home, is that I on a Friday evening, I have all kinds of specialities. Boiled corn. So we don't eat corn every day. Baked stuff, whether we bake it or we buy it. We didn't have the time to bake, so guess what? We buy it. And Sabbath evening for us is a big thing. A lot of food, a lot of good food, because we wanted over the years for children to associate Sabbath and worship with pleasantry and with joy and with laughter. We make a lot of jokes. My children and my wife, they joke on me and we have a good laugh. We share testimonies on a Friday evening because we are building a ritual that when we go through a crisis, when we are alone in a dark room by ourselves, we could go back in our memory and remember that shared value, that shared experience, rather, that shared memory. Next one. Of course, having a supportive network is very important to resilience. The people who study resilience tell us that when you have people who watch your back, people who looking out for you, people who you could run to and talk to, people who will pray for you, people who will talk you through a crisis, people who will encourage you, people who will support you and be a lift to you. There are some people who are weights on you. They are burdensome. They are negative. They are always putting you down and criticizing you. Those are not the kind of people that help in a crisis. People who are always quarreling and always looking at the negative side and who are always talking how bad it is and who are always pointing out the mistakes of young people. From a familial perspective, especially with teenagers, and during this COVID-19 and other crises, it is better to find them doing something good than looking for the bad that they do. And when you find them doing something good, you affirm it, And if you're a very critical woman or critical man, look for things to affirm in your spouse. And that would help in great measure in terms of that person not only, embracing you in that relationship, but also dealing with the crisis So knowing that you have people to support you, knowing you can run to people to help is very helpful. And that's one of the ingredients of people who have one of the variables, characteristics rather. I'm thinking about food when I say ingredients, to resilience. Next slide, please. Let me see how quickly I can do this one. When you read about resilience in most textbooks and most theorists, you will not see stress management as one of those variables, but I've added it. So these two last variables I've added based on my experience with working with families and working with couples. So I've added two: stress management. Of course, everything we have done is really stress management. So you wouldn't see in a textbook, manage, build resilience through stress management. You wouldn't see it. But I want to deliberately say stress management, all of the aspects of stress management would help in building resilience and dealing with a crisis. I will deal with two of them quickly. One is exercise, the other is sleep. Let's look at exercise. Next slide. All right. It is estimated that if you exercise 30 minutes a day, every day, or about 1 hour, every other day, research has recently shown, next slide, that if you try to make 7,500 steps, that would be equivalent to 12,000 steps. So the value you will get from just making 7,500 steps will be the same value you will get from making 12,000 steps. So some people try to make a 10-mile, or, I try to make 5 miles whenever I'm doing it. These days, we haven't been able to do it very much. That's about 10,000 steps. Well, research is saying you don't have to go 10,000. You can do 7,005, and that would be sufficient. It would have sufficient value to give you what you need to thrive. Of course, not only is exercise helpful to the young, but it is also helpful to the older population. And there is growing scientific evidence that regular exercise can play a role in the prevention of Alzheimer's disease, mild cognitive impairment, and dementia. Exercise has shown some promise in the treatment of these conditions. Actually, some research I was looking at quite recently showed that exercise can even work better, in some studies has worked better than psychopharmacological treatment or drugs. So there is a lot of promise in terms of what researchers are finding and the efficacy of exercise as it relates to brain preservation and the pushing away of Alzheimer's. But I'm saying to you, exercise is helpful in terms of dealing with a crisis. All right? It's beneficial at all stages. Of course, in Trinidad, we have a challenge in terms of juvenile overweight. What's the term we use there? Juvenile, and I'm looking at the time, so my brain going all over the place. Juvenile obesity, that's the word I was looking for. Of course, when you exercise, well, regardless of your age, it helps with your mental functioning, it helps to fight back some mood disorders like depression and so on. So exercise is very, very good. It helps with your lung function, it helps with your heart function. So I encourage you to get some of it. Next one, next slide, please. Sleep is also very important in terms of stress management. I'm therefore saying it's important toward managing a crisis and developing resilience. Adequate sleep, high quality sleep has been shown to be very helpful in terms of being a major obstacle to stress. And so it's a good builder to resilience. 6 to 8 hours a night is necessary. Of course, the quality of sleep is also very important. So if you're sleeping, and I remember a few nights ago, my wife and I were sleeping, and we both heard gunshots in our community. We were sleeping, of course. We don't usually hear gunshots. It sounded like a machine gun, and that interrupted sleep. So if you're sleeping and every hour you're getting up, for whatever reason, that is bad quality sleep, and the effect of that on your brain would be a negative factor in terms of building resilience and managing stress. Studies have shown that if you need 6 hours based on your ability and your ability and your capacity for good functioning. Some people need 8, some people need 6. One politician once said he only needs 2 hours, right? But most of us would need between 8 and 6. So if you lose, or if you don't get, research has shown quite recently, 19 minutes, if you get 19 minutes less, that 6 hours or that 8 hours, that will affect your functioning. So ensuring that you sleep sufficiently, ensuring that it's good quality sleep would help you in terms of managing stress. Next slide. And this is our last slide, and we'll take some questions, Randall, if we have. And if we don't get from our online folk, then you would throw some questions, and let's see if we can finish by 7. All right, next slide. Of course, many theorists don't talk to hope as a variable, as a direct variable, but I want to. And I want to end by saying to us this evening that just having hope is a factor in building resilience. Hope is the extent to which an individual perceives or thinks that he or she has control of his or her destiny. Another way to say that is to say, if one thinks he can make it, or if one thinks, or rather, or not make it, pardon me, it will determine if he makes it or doesn't make it. In other words, we can make it if we can see ourselves making it. If we can think that we can make it, and it is possible to make it, that will help us to make it, and it will give us a fighting chance as we make it. I have to tell you that resilience is not only seen in humans, resilience is also seen in animals. And of course, the scientists, those who do neuroscience, will tell you that the brain that is closest to the human brain is the brain of a mice. And that is why, mice are used very often for psychological research to help us figure out how the human brain works. And one researcher put 2 mice, what's the plural of mice? Mouse. 2 mouse in water. 2 mice? Okay, all right, whatever. Mice, yeah, 2 mice. And my wife just corrected me then. Thank you, sweetheart. So 1 mice was put in water and left there. The other mice was put in another container of water. Huh? All right, 1 mouse, she says. So the other mouse, or mouse, was taken out and put back in. Taken out and put back in. And guess what? The one that stayed in the water longer died faster than the one that was taken out and put back in. Taken out and put back in. In other words, if an optimistic mouse, right. If an optimistic mouse lives longer or lived longer because there was hope that he will come out and stay out, then optimistic, hopeful human beings will also live longer. So hope is a driver to resilience. And Maston says it is a driver of learning and resilience. Hope is when we see that the future is better than the past. And by the way, Sheldon, that my small thing that I just did, you all delete that, right? Very good. Thank you so much. So let's end by using one of my favorite Bible texts, Philippians 4:13, and Nadine and Selma and others. In my small thing, don't bring it up in the office, please. I'll fix it, right? Philippians 4:13 says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. If we know that we have help in Christ, in God, and that help is a strengthening factor. If we know that COVID-19 will end, if we know that in spite of a divorce, life will go on, if we know that in spite of the house being broken down, in spite of the fact that we were evicted, in spite of the fact, that there is illness or suicide, in spite of the fact that there is drug addiction or major psychopathology in the family, schizophrenia maybe, or something like that, post-traumatic stress disorder happening in the family. If we know that these things are going on, and we know that one day it will be better, weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. If we know that there is going to be a better day, that in itself would help us to be resilient. I want to ask you to go back to the YouTube channel presentation, and look back at what we were talking about. Just forget the mice mouse thing. And I hope that would help you in your journey to be better. Thank you very much. Randall, I don't know if there are questions. If there are, let's take some.
Of course, Pastor. Well, I'm so glad that you pointed that you ended when you did on that point. It's a very high point. And I'm also glad that you gave us an opportunity to see a husband and a wife laughing with each other and at each other. As you pointed out during your presentation. So we want to thank you for that live presentation there.
Thank you.
Online, the question is asked, could a resilient person break under pressure?
Well, it's a euphemism. If you're resilient, you wouldn't break. Of course, I need to point out, and maybe as I think about it, one can be resilient in one setting and be not resilient or not be resilient in another setting. So in the studies I've done, there were some people who were resilient at work, where they thrived at work, where everything was perfect at work, where they climbed up the ladder in terms of promotion, where they did work as they should. But because home is in a mess, when they get home, they are in a crisis, and it is chaotic. And maybe that's one of the reasons why, Randall, some people work so hard outside, and they leave very early, and they come home very late, so that they would not be at home. So the good thing is the qualities of resilience, the virtues or the characteristics of the resilient person will help somebody to thrive in any setting. But in my studies, I have not seen that an individual is resilient, but then just breaks. For that to happen, it would mean that they would have lost hope, and all that they would have built over time would have been diminished, and so they just give up. But that is what I would say to answer that question.
Okay. Now, possible, when I heard the question, I thought about Elisha. Remember Elisha, after he would have um, ended the 3 years of drought?
Yes, Elijah.
El- Elisha. I thought it was Elisha. With
Okay,
Ahab, after he ran in front of the chariot.
okay, Elijah.
Yes. Right after he ran in front of the
I
chariot.
was thinking about Elijah. Go ahead.
Right. He then found out that the queen Jezebel wanted to kill him.
Yeah, I think that's Elijah.
Right. Okay.
So the story I'm thinking about was the prophet on Mount Carmel.
On Carmel, yeah.
Right, he called down fire from heaven,
That's right.
and then a day after, or the same day, he heard that Jezebel wanted to kill him, and he went under the broom tree and he became suicidal.
That's right.
And God had
Tell
to
us
say,
about that. Tell us about that, because my mind went there when I saw the question.
yeah. And so it's interesting that even though Elijah was strong and powerful, and he was able to stand up, and a woman called Jezebel threatened him and made him become suicidal, Elijah he must have had, even though he was a prophet, he was a human, he must have had some deficits, I'm guessing, to make him be on such a high and then just flip immediately and go on a low.
Yeah.
Some people would call that, bipolar, being bipolar. I don't know, there's no test to say that he had difficulties in his psychological functioning. But let's not think that because he was a prophet and a man of God, he did not have the issues that we all have. I'm not saying he wasn't resilient, but I'm saying he showed signs of not having resilience. Even though he was a strong man, but of course not much is said about him, so we don't know the whole story about everything. But thank God, he was able to use the first technique we talked about, spirituality. He listened to God when God, through the angel, came and visited him at the broom tree, and God said, "Pick up yourself, boy, eat something, and let me go again." And so he used one of the tools that I'm sharing today to help him to bounce back, to help him to survive and to thrive.
Right. And so, Pastor, I think it makes the point as well that we're human. Regardless of who we are, we are
right.
human. And at the end of the day, we really need to rely on the strength of the Lord to provide us with that resilience that we need to overcome whatever we face.
Definitely. And let me repeat something I said at the previous program, I think the second installment. Some people feel that when they feel hurt, or they feel angry, or they feel upset, or they feel depressed during a pandemic, during a crisis, that this is extraordinary. I just want to remind us that these are normal feelings. These are feelings that those of us who work with from a psychological perspective and a therapeutic perspective, we understand. And sometimes just saying to somebody in counseling, how you feeling is normal. Normal people feel as you are feeling in this situation. Just saying that gives people an ease and helps them to understand that I'm okay in spite of how I feel.
Yes. So we're moving on from Elijah. Now we're going on to Pastor. Something that you spoke of that I want you to spend a little more time giving us advice on is positive outlook. How does someone muster up this positive outlook if you're in a situation where everything seems to be falling down around you? Even if you feel bad, do you still do positive self-talk? Do you fool yourself? Is it that you're fooling yourself?
Well, I have to say that many of us are trained and taught as children to think negatively. And many of us are taught, unfortunately, to give up. But I want you to think about children a little bit. Children are inherently resilient. Think about the first time you saw your son walk, Randall. There was something about that boy. There was something about that girl that gave them a drive, a push, a lift to want to make a step. I'm saying that even when there is a lot of negativity a lot of negative vibes, a lot of negative output. God has placed within each of us the capacity to want to lift ourselves and to try again. When God is there helping us and we are fighting him by saying, God, I'm done, I'm fed up, I had it, I go throw in the towel, that makes it more debilitating for us to get up and to go again. But there is something in each of us that gives us the drive. When people just give up and they shut off and they take their lives, it is simply because everything is shut down and there is nothing more to tap into. And so, of course, this is not the case in every situation. And they're hopeless, so they just give it up and they kill themselves. But there is something in us that helps us to fight and to be resilient and to go behind the positive. So I'm saying, even when we have those negative thoughts, Randall, we have to fight it back.
Right.
And choose to say, I will not die.
That's right.
I will not give up. I will not throw in the towel. I will not give up my marriage. I will not give up my wife. I will not give up my husband. I will not give up on my son. I'm going to fight back.
Yes. No, Pastor, I know our time is short, but I see there's a quite important question, and I wanted you to answer before we signed off for the evening. And it's this. It's the person says, you said in a crisis, learn to touch. And the person wants to know, is it possible where there's bitterness between two members of a family that the touch can make the situation worse?
Yes, very possible. I expected that question. Actually, I get it all the time when I'm doing seminars, marriage seminars. So it's important, not only when things are good or bad, rather, that you touch, but when things are good. And of course, you need to know your spouse. You need to know your children. If touching, makes it worse, then you don't touch at all. But my suggestion is, and has always been, do your best to resolve your issues. And even when there are issues, a mild touch. I'm not talking about a hug now. I'm not talking about an embrace. I'm not talking about a squeeze. A mild touch on the shoulder will help to dissipate some of the venom. Some people will say, don't touch me, move your hand. And on some beds, some husbands and some wives touch each other accidentally and they get a kick, because not even in those circumstances is touching allowed. But if touching is part of the menu of the family function and functioning, then when there's a crisis, when there's a problem, touching will work even more. Then, if the person says, "Don't touch me, don't touch me," I'm telling you, don't touch me, then don't touch the person. But if the person could appreciate a touch, a gentle touch, that would be fine. Unfortunately, sometimes our mouths are too vicious and too hard and harsh that a gentle touch will not work, because the mouth has done too much damage. Unfortunately, Randall, and we dealt with it before, in some families, some people rough up their loved ones, not just the man roughing up the woman, but sometimes the woman roughing up the man and hitting him and slapping him and cuffing him, so that when in a crisis, a gentle touch is tried, they pull back, because, touch is associated with pain for many people. All right? So fix your issues. Get counseling, get help. But touching people, the skin is the largest organ of the body. It has the most nerve endings. There are a lot of people around there who are starving for a touch. When you go to church, look at how many young people hugging up each other. Look at how the brethren shaking each other. Of course, with social distancing, we can't do that anymore. So people are starving right now for touch. And that is simply because in many homes, touching is not part of the menu of family. It's not part of the menu of family life. And I just want to encourage people who are looking on, do a gentle touch. Touch your children on their head. Pray for them. Touch them on the head and pray. Start with that. Touch them on the shoulder. How you going, boy? How you going, girl? Trying to get a kiss from your teenager wouldn't work. and teenagers, they want no kiss. You know, if you could take a little hug, take it. Do it when things are good, so that when things are bad, it would not be a stranger trying to be a nicey-nicey.
Yeah. Well, Pastor Moses, we want to really thank you for the wonderful presentation. You provided us with excellent pearls of wisdom. I really hope that the people that listen this evening will take those messages to heart and that they will implement it in their lives as we go forward. At this time, before we sign off, let us have a short word of prayer. Our heads are bowed, our eyes are closed. Father in heaven, Lord, you see the situation that we are in with the world at this time, and you see the trials and tribulations that many persons are going through. We pray, dear Father, that you can help instill in each and every person a sense of resilience, a sense of power, a sense of purpose, a sense of hope that will allow them to come out on the other side of this crisis stronger and better people, better equipped to serve you and to serve their fellow man. Continue to be with us, continue to bless us, help us to be more and more like you each and every day, dear Father. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
To all of our listeners and our viewing public, we want to thank you for joining us for this Surviving a Crisis series. We are going on to the 10th installment next week, which is entitled Psychological Tools for Healing During COVID. And this will be presented to us by none other than Dr. Edward Clark, who is a professor of psychology at the University of the Southern Caribbean. And we look forward to the pearls of wisdom that Dr. Clark will be providing to us. Once again, thank you for being here with us and see you next week.